If you would have the realm hold beyond this winter, you must begin with the ledger and end with the oath. The ledger tallies grain, gold, and graves. The oath binds the living to endure the tally's truth. Everything between is campaign. Marching columns, sealed letters, burnt wax, and the courage to speak plainly. So I will speak plainly. What has been done cannot be undone, but it can still be understood. What remains to do can be done, and we must do it with a cold mind and a warm will. A generation of mistakes brought us to the edge. An easy peace insulated by fat harvests. A dynasty that spent more than it earned. A faith fattened on alms and resentment. Proud lords who learned to use their swords on their neighbors. The old pacts that held the realm together were worn smooth by practice and then forgotten. When the boom of the last war came, it broke more than walls. You know the litany even if you forbid yourself the names. Fathers bled sons into the river. Daughters used daggers meant for suitors. The small folk learned new taxes the same day they learned to bury their children. A capital that fed on salt and stories watched its debts ripen like bruises. When, at last, the September burst into light and dust, it was not the first sin and not the last. It was a declaration, a decision that the rot would no longer be treated with bombs and prayers but with fire. From that fire came the first truth. A crown lands on the head that can bear its weight, not the head that fears its ledgers. The second truth followed. Leverage is not loyalty, but it can shape loyalty. Debts, hostages, grain, fear, and the common hunger to see winter answered all pull on the same rope. And the third truth, which was hardest to speak aloud in chambers where courtiers made their lives on half-words. Peace was never the inheritance of this realm. It is the yield of good accounts kept by those who can command armies. You can reinforce a bridge with coin, with law, with songs, or with soldiers. We had to use all four at once. The point where all this turned was not in a hall but in a yard of snow. We brought the dead to heal long enough for them to walk into the city under chains of iron and wonder. I do not mean the corpse that was dragged into the dragon pit, though that too had its use, but the idea we fastened behind its teeth. The crown would answer a threat no banner could answer alone. That demanded not a coalition but a command. You remember the morning. The wind crept through the basalt and the ash at the pit's edge. Someone's breath froze in the air and glittered in the slant light. The old stones groaned as if dragons still worried their bellies against them, even as their skulls lay below. Some regarded the chained abomination with horror, some with fascination, and some with calculation. The calculation is what mattered. We obtained signatures that day richer than any dowry, oaths to accept a wartime reckoning, not a balancing of the old scores, but a suspension of them. It was called nothing official in the moment because naming things creates enemies as quickly as laws do, but the clerks later labeled it the Oaths of Long Winter. Every lord who meant to survive swore to furnish men and grain to a common host under the crown's banners, and to accept the crown's adjudications in all disputes arising during the campaign against the dead. Those who did not swear found their trade charters halted the next day, their ports inspected, their letters intercepted, their sons watched.
Va clarifis.
Those bleak signatures were the hinge. If the queen had balked there, had played for time instead of legitimacy, events would have drifted into other hands. The dragon queen would have smothered the skies with confidence and fire. The northern king would have hustled a wary world into a crusade with or without the capital. The Vale would have waited and then sided with whomever their snows told them would return with bread. A decision tree lay before us. At its first fork stood the question of debt and credit. The crown's debt had bloated with the old king's hunts and the tournaments that passed for diplomacy, with the boys' feasts, with the lion lord's subsidies, with bribes passed as bride prices. In the aftermath of the September, the city's gold lenders were as frightened as the poor. When fear rules a market, coin hides. So the decision that mattered most did not wear mail. She summoned the Bravosi factors and showed them the new schedule of war, not the old schedule of excuses. The model was simple and as old as trade. If you can convince your creditor that your war will increase the value of his bond, he will fund your army as if it were his own. The Iron Bank had never lost a war for lack of patience, but it had ruined many kings for lack of receipts. We put receipts on the table. We pledged customs on the rookeries that handle the Western trade. We pledged the Crownlands forests for ship timber. We pledged the road tolls between the Mander and the Rose Road. We pledged the iron mines in the west not as abstraction but as open ledgers they could inspect through factors embedded in our counting house. And then, because neither bank nor crown builds armies without faith of a different kind, we invested the faith, not as an ally of conscience, but as a partner of necessity. There was no high sparrow in those days to stand apart from coin and compromise. There were dozens of ambitious septons who remembered his sermons but preferred their incense. We endowed poorhouses as logistics nodes, granaries as sanctuaries, and the rebuilding of the September on a foundation of loyalty rather than rebuke. In exchange, the Star became a place where war oaths could be taken and believed. Faith is a currency cheaper than gold when you can spend it, and more expensive than blood when you cannot. We spent it. None of this was kind. All of it was necessary. Then came men and ships. We did not waste the Reach's temper on questions of hoe. Nor we spent it on bread. Randall Tarley preferred lances to ledgers, but even he could understand the mathematics of a million mouths. Under a general levy disguised as a religious duty, we made household stores the basis of the realm's life. The High Tower, proud and unbent, was informed that its famous beacon would be judged not by how far it lit the sea but by how many sacks of grain found their way up the Mander. The cost was paid in groaning carts and empty plates, in small folk who learned to tuck away one stale loaf because tomorrow held less certainty than today. The benefit went to the host, our host. We conscripted wagons at rates that looked fair on paper and felt like robbery in barns. The accountants kept meticulous records to remind everyone this was a loan for victory, not a theft for its own sake. Keep those records clean and the realm forgives, eventually. Let them be sloppy and men remember until their grandsons die. As for ships, the Ironborn must always be locked in their own logic, or else they will lock us in it instead. Their reavers love a victory when it gives them something to drown, but winter seas respect neither oiled beards nor iron prayers. Euron could be baited by spectacle, and he liked nothing so much as to believe he had baited others. We used him to do what he could not resist doing. He hunted a dragon queen's supply lines because he was told she thought no man dared. We let him believe the plan was his. We let him name the ships after dreams. We let him strut on a prow gilded from a stolen altar. He bled the Dornish for us before we said a single sweet word to Sunspear. Dorne watches the rest of us like a cat watches water. It can be made to drink only if the bowl is warmed and the room kept quiet. Later, a quiet room and a warm bowl were arranged. But first the fleet. The dragons were the second fork. The world had not seen flying fire in living memory. Suddenly the sky wore it like a crown. Every whisper said nothing built by mortal hand could unseat that crown. That was almost true. But even dragons must eat. And even dragons must choose where to sleep and in what wind to ride out a storm. We placed new scorpions on the walls. Not the oafish ballistae of old parades but turntables with sights, trained crews, and a doctrine that treated dragons as siege engines that chose their own angles. And we developed a wartime law nobody had bothered to write before. No captain may bring pitch or oil near a dragon fight. If a dragon lit a tower's store, the tower itself became a weapon against its rider. Limit fuel, limit fire. Similarly, the city's rooftops were stripped of innocent thatch to deny comment to heat. Small measures matter when the world believes only in spectacles. But one does not unite 7 kingdoms by firing arrows at the sky. The more important work happened in letters and in kitchens. Remember this. A garrison eats first from its honor, only then from its bowls. We made honor edible. The Queen legitimized the last scion of Storm's End, no longer a bastard of the Forges but a lord with paperwork that could stand up in any court we convened. The Stormlands love few things as they love their own, and a recognized heir was worth 10,000 speeches about loyalty. He was given stipend and charge to fortify the steppe coast and blockade what would soon become a corner of the war you either know intimately or not at all. And because symbols must be made into law, he was named warden with stipulations that tied his levies to ours when the road ran north. The north itself was not taken. It was invited to command and then outcommanded. Jon Snow, call him by whichever of his names you prefer, Raging Blood approves of them all, cared less about crowns than about graveyards. That made him both easy and hard to bargain with. The easy thing was this: promise men, bread, and fire to burn the dead. The hard thing, mean it. The queen meant it. She did not promise and betray. She promised and paid. Jaime took the lion's share of Lannister men north with carts of barley and barrels of pitch. I do not need to remind you what that cost here in the city. The mutterings, the long afternoons where the gates yawned like a mouth lacking teeth. But it bought something no one had thought to buy since the gilded days of the first Targaryens. A sense, anchored in sights and in stomachs, that the capital might be far, but it was not indifferent. When the undead finally came down on Winterfell like a frozen river given fury, our banners were in the line. Our engineers had salted the fields with traps of wire and stakes and trenches that would drink wildfire. Our ravens had tied the horns of units to cycles of watch based on cold, not sun. The North fought with its old ferocity. The combined host fought with new coherence. The dead were not impressed, but they were inconvenienced. If that battle had gone the other way, the realm would now be a theme in a song some Braavosi child hums while learning to count. It did not. It cost everything it had to, and a little more. The Night King took a dragon in the far reaches of a lake not yet named on old maps. Then he lost it and himself to a dagger put where most thought no dagger could find a path. Do not invest strategy with fate. Invest it with preparation and a willingness to throw the last coin when the table demands it. We threw it. Some call it madness. It was simple arithmetic. We placed our heaviest wagers on one truth. If the North survived with our banners stitched to theirs, the South could be persuaded to forget what it had wanted yesterday. People do not remember what they have never eaten. They remember the last warm meal. In the aftermath, it was the river between memory and appetite that we needed to bridge. Dothraki, who survived, wanted to ride. Unsullied wanted to stand until told to lie down. The northern banners wanted to go home and count their dead and harvest what the spring might, by some mercy, coax from Ullin's soil. The Dragon Queen wanted, once again, to be obeyed. We gave almost all of them something they could mistake for satisfaction. Orders were written that sent the Dothraki down to the Crownlands to become the swift backbone of Coastwatch and Convoy, where speed mattered more than land rights. They were given silver wages counted with the same meticulous tedium as any company of contractors. The Unsullied were assigned to garrison work on the Rose Road where every furlong could be numbered. A place where obedience meant safety to 1,000 families who had known neither for years. Those two placements did for the Southern Heart what one cannot do in a speech. They healed the shock of foreign banners by making them useful in our daily life. And the Queen across the table? We gave her a mirror and we framed it in law. The Oaths of Long Winter had not named a successor, but they had created a thought, an enduring authority that answered to the need of the moment. We held a great council, not in name and not with trumpets, but in function, by convening the lords who had fed our host and bled at Winterfell in a hall whose tapestries had been hurriedly mended after moth and man alike had done their worst. We framed the choice not as a contest of bloodlines, but as an audit. Who had paid? Who had delivered? Who had kept the book straight? The crown had. It had not reneged on supply. It had not fled its debts. It had disciplined its own soldiers when they pillaged under its banners. It had invited the faith to count the barrels. It had asked nothing of the North that the South had not matched, regardless of prior pride. If the Dragon Queen had been, at that moment, as patient with perception as she was with fire, she might have won those tired, careful hearts. But she was impatient, in part because grief makes everyone impatient. She had lost friends, dragons, and certainties. She had not lost her temper, and she should have. When she demanded fealty as a right and found instead an argument about receivables, she read it as an insult. We had meant it as a reprieve. That misreading gave us the final branch of the decision tree. You can pacify a rival, you can bind a rival, or you can break a rival. Pacification was unlikely given the number of tables she had turned over and the number of cups she had poured out with her own hand. Binding was conceivable. A marriage arranged not for bed but for banner. A treaty of execution that kept a dragon on our payroll and the sea lanes to Dragonstone as her dowry. That was the plan we prepared to offer publicly. Breaking was left aside out of prudence, and because an injured dragon with pride still unbroken is the most dangerous creature invented. We chose binding. The offer was made, neat as parchment gets in a wind. Recognition as queen consort or princess of Dragonstone with sovereign rights over that island and its fisheries. Revenues guaranteed in perpetuity, custody of the city's South Tower garrison, a seat on the small council, and a writ that would let her appoint 3 judges to the newly constituted Court of Winter Oaths. In return, she would swear the simple, terrible sentence that had held this land together before: to be true to the crown and to protect the realm with fire when asked and without discretion. It should have worked. It did not. When a person's hunger is not for food but for pasts, nothing you serve will satisfy. She took Dragonstone as an insult, the court seats as patronage beneath her, the court as an admission that we knew the North did not trust us. She was right about the last. She was wrong about the terms. The North trusts receipts and soldiers more than it ever trusts assurances. The plan to bind became the plan to break when she chose Dragonfire over the arithmetic that had saved the world 2 months before. There would be a second round, and it would be fought in the South, where warmth returns quicker but disgust lasts longer. Here is where you would expect me to sing praises of scorpions and of wildfire. These games are older than kings. In truth, it was neither that won the second round. It was emptiness. The whitened fields had starved the Dragon Queen's stores. Her commanders were proud but unaccustomed to campaigning without abundance. Her remaining dragon could still smother a battlement, but it could not fill a soldier's belly the night after. We put nothing where she expected to find us, and we put everything where she thought nothing could survive. The roses of the Reach, not yet replanted, left behind cellars and desolated arsenals that we had mapped and mined. Convoys were announced, intercepted, and replaced by decoys that drew dragons into gauntlets of rope and hooks instead of bolts. We trained slingers to throw iron nets into the air when the beast stooped to take a rider. We offered ransoms for small, petty things, tools, barrels, hammers, that became more valuable than captains. This is not gallant war. This is grown-up war. Grown-up War 1. When at last the dragon dipped into the old harbor at dusk to torch a line of cogs and found instead that the cogs were sacks of sand rigged to explode into enormous cold breathless clouds to blind eyes and stifle lungs, it screamed. That scream, not the bolts, not the rumbling of an ignited storehouse, not the cheers, was the moment the South decided to move from fear to anger. The city whose roofs had been stripped to deny fire now denied the sound. The echo died. And because in war you must be ready for the moment when the thing you have planned for, feared, and dreamed of finally occurs, we had the right men in the right alleyways at the right time. Euron's fleet, which would have betrayed us the moment the wind turned in his sails, had been lured out to play at pirates along the steppe coast by small holds stuffed with birdseed and rumor. When he turned back to claim glory, he found fire ships in the channels that cared nothing for glory. The dragon, Disso, re-entered, bled from a storm of iron that no song will honor, and fell. You can pity it now, or you can live in the world it left. We chose the second at the time because pity does not put bread on plates. The Dragon Queen refused to be ransomed to any condition but victory. In war there is a price for that refusal. Ours was a clean one. She died facing forward. The grief that followed split her own army not along lines of blood but lines of function. The Dothraki, who ride because the world becomes smaller under hoof, scattered because the world had become too large again. The Unsullied remained because the world had told them to remain. We offered their commander something he could not refuse because it answered the only question that mattered to him. What happens to those who follow orders when the one who gave them is gone? We turned his soldiers into citizens by degree, not by proclamation. Land grants along the Trident adjusted for their customs. Rights to marry or not without interference. Pensions paid not in coin whose mint he did not trust but in grain credits and salt rights in 2 ports whose harbor masters learned his language. He accepted not because of love but because of certainty. Certainty is what the North took as its reward, not independence, which would have delivered them back into the arms of the snows as if into a cold lover who will never feed them. Autonomy grounded in measurable privileges. Wardenship made hereditary, not at the crown's good humor but at law. Rights to levy their own men in their own time without asking the crown for a seal. Exemptions from certain tariffs during winters longer than a specified cycle of moons demonstrated daily by the weather factors we licensed and they could audit. Their pride was not insulted because we did not call these arrangements charity. We called them the price of a truth we could both live with. In turn, they acknowledged the crown as the only authority that could negotiate with foreign powers, strike coin, appoint a master of laws, and adjudicate in disputes between regions. They sent hostages, yes, but we called them fosterlings, and we raised them with care. Language matters when children will grow into fathers. This, then, is the story of the uniting you asked me to render as numbers. It begins with a crown willing to show its accounts, and it ends with a realm willing to admit that an expensive peace is cheaper than another convenient war. The phases of governance and campaign were not accidental. They were scheduled, and though schedules bend, they do not break if their ligaments are sound. Phase 1 was stabilization. The city was the beating heart that had learned to palpitate, so we fed it calm. Prices were fixed not with threats but with shortages reduced by convoy, and with a simple decree more powerful than any army. No baker may cut the bread he sells with straw. You would think this trivial. It is not. It said the crown saw the small thefts that make the large thefts possible. The gold cloaks did not become saints, but they did become accountants. Their commanders were paid a sum tied to the number of disputes adjudicated without blood, not the number of arrests made. A godless innovation, some said. Those who counted their teeth after a market day called it blessed. We mended aqueducts. We hired carpenters to rebuild wharves. We conscripted idle men with the promise that one day back under arms would earn one day's labor wage counted fairly. Then we put priests to work. Morning sermons about the charity that builds granaries. Evening sermons about the sin of hoarding. The faith began to feel like it was shepherding again, not shearing. Phase 2 was the Northern Campaign. You know its bones. Requisitions made with letters of credit redeemable at any crown exchange. Supply lines staggered to avoid spring floods. Torch lines built along windward gaps. What you may not know are the arguments that were made nightly over candles guttering down. Whether to commit cavalry in small packets to draw the dead into traps, or to keep them concentrated for a final blow. Whether to risk a sortie into the bar Rolands to break a flanking maneuver that might not come. Whether to husband wildfire for the walls or pour it into the fields immediately and deny ourselves the comfort of a sturdy last resort. War is a series of bets with ugly returns. We took the spear points off some of our most stupid lords by putting them on inspection duty far from glory. If you want men to behave, send a clerk with them who answers only to a ministry that knows your hand. The Crown's clerk corps grew fivefold during that phase. You will be tempted to disband it now that the marching is done. I urge you to resist that temptation, because the battles to come require auditors more than they require heroes. Phase 3 was the Southern Pacification, which is a proud euphemism for beating men until they admit they would rather negotiate. It was accomplished with fewer hangings than songs will claim and more fines than old men remember. We levied against houses that had taken dragon coin and used it to purchase loyalty in the plainest form. Forgiving arrears for houses that had bent the knee early, forgiving little or nothing for those who argued. Is this the justice that mothers pray for? No, but sovereigns are not mothers. The justice was structural. River crossings were returned to common use. Tariffs were standardized. Courts were made to meet on schedules, not whims. Old privileges that had been Grandpa's favorite story were politely retired when they made a sheriff's job impossible. Not all of those sheriffs were ours. More importantly, it did not matter. We expanded the writ of the Court of Winter Oaths into a permanent tribunal with mixed benches. A crown judge, a local jurist, and a prelate. That court gave even the wronged a chance to shout in a controlled room. That is the difference between feuds and states. Phase 4 was reconstruction. It is unglamorous to speak of drains when one has bled on walls, but drains prevent disease and disease kills more than swords. Ditches were dredged. Frost-damaged bridges were rebuilt with arches thick enough that any mason who dared cut corners lost the coin he had already been paid. We issued bonds. Not fairy tale promises of future plunder, but obligations indexed to salt, to the number of ships passing the gullet, to the sacks of barley reaching the hook. The bank blessed them because they could see the streams downstream. We price-stabilized timber with a crown monopoly that lasted exactly 4 years and 1 harvest, then released it with a ceremony that made men feel like they had won something by patience. People like to be applauded for waiting. The applause is cheaper than timber. Phase 5, the one that offends warriors most, was normalization. The army shrank. The men who had learned to move on orders were told to move for market. Some became garrison. Some became road builders. Some became beggars. We reduced the army's size not by proclamation but by pressure. Wages fell in the winter after victory because victory pays in pride, not coin. The men who enlisted for coin went home. The men who enlisted for pride stayed and were told to wear that pride outside taverns. If you disarm them too quickly, they form companies that exist to drink. If you disarm them slowly and give them tasks they can talk about, they boast about fences and drains as if they were gates and walls. In time, that boast becomes the story they tell themselves when they are old and hearing again. Give a man a story he can live with, and he will sell his sword to you rather than to your enemies. Now the fiscal dynamics that make all this more than noise. We taxed air and water, that is to say, trade and salt. We reduced the head taxes that make farmers flee and increased the levies that change behavior. Surcharges on hoarding past a certain measure checked monthly by inspectors who have no interest in the land themselves. Punishments for price fixing enacted against guilds as institutions rather than any one man. A ban on export of grain and wood during winter's 3rd year that was enforced by impounding ships as well as by pious shouting. The Queen's courts handed out exemplary penalties, not arbitrary ones. Merchants could plan around that. When men can plan, they invest. And when they invest, they forgive. Forgive insults, forgive dynasties, forgive even old enemies, because profit over a long horizon looks like mercy when you do not think about it. The faith's place in this was delicate. Prayer is a resource as touchy as wildfire. If hoarded, it sours. If thrown around, it burns the wrong people. We compelled the 7 servants to account for their wealth in public in exchange for the right to bless the crown's redesigned coin. That was the bargain. We stood the new September on pillars engraved with the names of every house, great and minor, that had given grain or gold to the war. Vanity is cheaper than marble. We allowed the faith to preach against sins the crown wished to reduce out of necessity, usury, impurity, fraud, while reminding them that God does not dwell in riot. Clerics who tried to create an armed confraternity again found themselves confronted not with soldiers but with auditors and with the stories of widows hired to lay brick. It is very hard to recruit zealots against women being paid fair wages to rebuild their own neighborhoods. The High Septon, chosen for his ability to nap through meetings and to smile like a saint at the unhappy, served his purpose. Belief was kept in its church. Law was kept in chambers. The two shook hands in public and argued in private, which is the only arrangement that works. Who benefited? Those who invest in roads profit from tolls. Merchants in Lannisport who had learned to send their sons to sea young and their coin to the capital older found that their fleet, once a trifling thing next to the gales we had known, could carry grain, soldiers, and letters without being sank by gods or men. The Hightowers, who had prayed to avoid trade like a man prays to avoid love, learned the city could handle 2 ships at once if both had a reason to reach their docks instead of King's Landings. The smiths of the West minted coin by the cartload and saw their profit taxed at a rate that made them grumble but never plot. The towns along the Rose Road fattened on garrisons and on the nameless acts of commerce that pass between soldiers and those who feed them. Even the literate poor, scribes, ledgermen, tally women, discovered that a crown hungry for receipts and a faith hungry for lists could furnish full stomachs. Who paid? The Riverlands, who always pay because they stand between everyone else's appetites. We garrisoned their crossings, we detained their men, we audited their harvests with a strictness that bordered on insult, and we did it because we had to keep armies from who they had always belonged to, those who come wading out of fields with claim and grievance. The Stormlands paid in youth. We legitimized one scion to lead them and paid him a king's ransom in responsibilities. They accepted because it is better to carry a yoke you can name than to wear a chain you cannot see. Dorne paid in patience. They watched as their old grudges were turned into new arrangements that looked neutral but favored us. They were made ambassadors to the markets and masters of little luxuries. A crown's gift that buys time and respect, and an insult that will not be remembered long because money left in a hot room loses its anger. We arranged sensitivity tests at each phase because strategy without contingencies is memory without meaning. Suppose we said that winter lasts not 3 years but 5. Can the granaries endure? The numbers said yes if we limit exports, cut court ceremonies, and accept a gray palette at our tables. It said no if we insist on wine baths and purple dye. So the queen wore domestic cloth, and the court learned to drink ale like sons of millers. Suppose we said that the faith regains appetite for arms and that a clever preacher convinces mothers that their sons die because sovereigns are godless. What then? We created a clergy of our own, but did not call it clergy. Inspectors who were trained to count were trained also to tell stories about what their counting bought. A village saved from fever when the drain was cleared. A monastery spared from bandits by an unspectacular patrol. Numbers win debates in councils. Stories win markets and inns. Our inspectors carried both. Suppose we said that ships from Volantis or from Karth take advantage of our recovery to dump cheap cloth, cheap iron, cheap baubles in our ports, bankrupting our guilds until we are their debtor in a subtler way than we had been the banks. We created a tariff schedule keyed to the weight of cargo rather than its price. Harder to lie about weights when inspectors are trained to weigh. If they attempted to bribe the scales, we displayed the bribes before the 7 literal bribes nailed to doors. Humiliation is a stronger deterrent than prison for men who care for status. Suppose that a plague slithers up from southern ports. Then we cut travel not by speeches but by ferry schedules. If there is nowhere to be taken, the sick cannot outrun sense. Supposing that the young queen's womb fails, fertility being the coin kings cannot strike. We established a line of succession that made legitimacy a function of performance as much as blood. That is a delicate way of saying we normalized the idea that merit can climb if blood fails. It is dangerous. It is also the only way to create stability when fate refuses to bend. The decision tree's largest branch, however, remains external. The Iron Islands do not forget that their sport is other men's work. If Euron, or whatever clown climbs onto the prow to imitate him, understands that his easiest plunder lies again along the Mander, he will return. Our sensitivity test here was not naval. It was social. When small fishermen can sell catch at a price guaranteed by the crown twice a week, they become informers for free. When they realize their children will be moved to the city for schooling if their villages are raided 3 times in a season, they become ferocious. We created a relocation policy with dignity. Families affected by raids had first choice of stalls in the fish markets under the rebuilt September, rent-free for 1 year. It sounds minor. It is revolutionary. It means raiders no longer create easy victims. They create new citizens who hate them with articulate voices and new guilds at their back. Now, the plausible end states of this realm and the horizons of their stability, stated without perfume. First, a hard monarchy that treats oaths as law and law as coin, robust for a decade and brittle thereafter. Under this end state, our shipyards flourish, our roads widen, and our courts become notorious for predictability. That predictability will breed complacency among those who profit most. Complacency begets corruption, and corruption creates a black market in justice. The horizon of stability under such a rule is 10 to 12 years, ending abruptly when a scandal large enough to shock the cities coincides with a poor harvest. To prolong it, a sovereign must perform a public purge not of enemies but of friends. It will be ugly. It will also be necessary. Second end state. A federated peace in which North, Vale, Riverlands, and Dorne enjoy guarantees that make their lords feel like kings without making them kings. Under this arrangement, our ability to negotiate wars is hampered, but our internal taxes become progressive and our disputes resolvable. The stability horizon is 20 years if the southern harvests remain average and if the faith is kept in its lane. The risk is not secession. It is drift. The crown becoming the place men send petitions when they have failed to persuade their cousins. This is not a tragedy. It is humility. The remedy is periodic pageantry that does not embarrass the hungry. Symbolic oaths renewed with bread and salt as much as with trumpets. Third end state. A theocratic upset, temporary but exhausting, in which a charismatic prelate marries grievance to ritual and turns bread queues into processions. This arrives not because the sovereign is wicked, but because patience fails in lean years. Its stability horizon is 5 years, marked by a fever of lawmaking and lawbreaking. It will end when the prelate tries to command the counting house and the clerks desert him for the crown's coin. The cost of surviving this phase is in blood and in the quality of justice afterward. It can be avoided by never allowing alms to substitute for wages for more than 1 season in 5. The faith is a lamp. Keep it trimmed, and it will not burn the house. 4th end state, foreign entanglement made permanent. A triad of cities across the narrow sea will try to use debt to purchase influence here. They will bid for guilds and for seats on guild councils, bid for named rights on docks, bid for naming rights on children if we let them. If allowed, our merchant class will become both richer and unmoored. They will discover the delicious appetite of investing abroad while their wives wear foreign dyes. The stability horizon in such an arrangement is 2 generations. The danger comes when a foreign market collapses, as foreign markets do, and our credit evaporates in sympathy, leading to a harvest's worth of empty purses at once. The countermeasure is simple and brutal. Limit foreign stakes to percentages that return profit but never yield control. The bank will bridle. It will also smile politely and buy bonds. 5th end state, succession shock. A sovereign dies without a popular heir. Cousins remember they are cousins, and swords remember where they are hung. The realm decides whether to accept a council of regents, a hoist that would go against our new appetite for coarsely efficient command, or to let the small folk choose in a fit of pretend democracy that will sicken into demagoguery before a year is out. The stability horizon here is as short as the space between 2 breaths. The only defense is to normalize succession rehearsal. Let the heir, whatever their age or sex, sit for 6 hours a week hearing petitions. In 2 years, a pattern will establish itself. Petitioners will begin saying "Your Grace" to the heir by accident when the sovereign is present. The heart learns what the head must eventually decide. What of the unsated and the unsated within, the men and women who never find a cradle big enough for their want? You will not smother them with kindness or with cruelty. You can recruit them. Universities do it in other lands. We will do it with a corps whose name is deliberately dull. We will call them surveyors. Their work will be the work that explains our work to us. Counting bridges, analyzing markets, assessing the faith's treasury's claims, predicting harvests from rain and leaf, calculating how many men a house can levy before its fields rebel. Some will be spies in everything but name. They will not be loved. They will be indispensable. Put one in every garrison. Assign one to each major sept. Invite one to each noble's hunt under pretext of mapping the forest. Give each one a junior to train. 10 years from now, if you fund this boredom, you will have the most dangerous thing a realm can possess: institutional memory. A word about mercy. It is expensive and it buys you very much. A word about terror. It is cheap and it buys you very little. The September burned, and many deserved to answer for what they had made of it. But fire purchases silence. Silence is not assent. The uniting of kingdoms cannot rest on silence. It must rest on people whose interests are tied to the same rope even if their hearts are not. That is why the fiscal measures matter more than the banners, and the faith's cooperation matters more than its adoration. That is why we normalized the presence of former enemies not by pardoning them in speeches but by making them learn the geography of a market day. That is why the Queen endured songs that praised her generals more often than they praised her, because sovereigns who demand songs end up with songs and nothing else. A final sensitivity test, because I would be too comfortable otherwise. Suppose that magic returns in a form we have not anticipated. A second spring of dragon eggs, a whispering forest in the north that moves when no one looks, a plague that reads prayers, a sword that makes men cowards. We cannot count a return of wonder without losing count of ourselves. The only defense against wonders is to keep books that wonder cannot falsify. When a dragon hatches, its keeper must be given a ledger and a salary. When the trees talk, their words must be translated into law by men who can write. The crown should own wonder as it owns coin, by striking its face upon it and by tolerating its trade in regulated stalls. The unknown will always arrive. Our policy should be that of the harbor master. You may dock in our realm and pay the price, or you may wander outside and find no rope. I have spoken as if numbers are swords because they are, and as if words are fortresses because they can be. This is not a contempt for those who fought. I have sent many to die whom I loved more than I love the sum of all these paragraphs. But we are beyond the glamour of thrusts and parries. We inhabit the time when revolts begin not with horns but with shortages, and when victories look like rows of brick placed by hands that prefer calluses to headlines. The queen won by believing the deadliness of such things when others mocked them. She gave creditors schedules and commanders bread. She turned marriage from a romance back into a treaty. She treated dragons as problems of breath and bone rather than as gods. She used the faith not as a battering ram but as a chorus. This is how you tie a rope through 7 pieces of land that have made a sport of strangling each other. If you would keep this rope from cutting the hands that hold it, take care whom you reward and when. Do not reward quickly. Men who are paid too fast forget what they were paid for. Do not reward slowly. Men who are paid too late learn that the realm's gratitude is another way to make them beg. Reward publicly when it will teach a lesson, and privately when it will ease a complicated conscience. Allow for 1 piece of poetry every year at festival. A pageant, a new statue, a day when bread is free because bread is not always free. Let children grow up believing this is normal. Let their parents know it isn't. Now, you ask me about the horizon of this particular union, the one the queen forged by force, finance, faith, and frost. I will not insult you by claiming it can last forever. Nothing lasts forever, not because of conspiracies but because people age. Today's newborn will vote in the only poll that counts, in the markets and in bed, with their feet and with their wombs. If we keep this steady for 10 years, they will assume steadiness is normal. If we keep it for 20, they will question the need for a sword on the throne at all. They will tempt us with their contempt for the struggles that made their lives possible. Do not punish them for that contempt. It is the reward we were trying to buy them. But do not accept their untested fixes in place of our tested parts. Allow their experiments in safe places, guilds, city councils, literary salons where gems are worn like arguments. Forbid their experiments in unsafe places, the army, the counting house, the courts. The crown should not suffocate its children. The crown should say, "Not yet," with a smile so practiced it looks like the dawn. I do not pretend that all this was inevitable. It was not. Bargains almost failed. Ships almost sank. Hearts almost soured. Queen's resolve was not the absent thing men brag about after victory. It was the visible thing that made enemies careful. She had to be cruel and chose to be precise. That is the difference between a butcher and a surgeon. But even surgeons lose patience. She lost some. She regretfully let others go who could not be cured. She made mistakes, and because we are not gods, we made them with her. The crucial thing is that the mistakes were not compounded by pride. She altered course when a clerk's pencil told her to. I cannot praise anything more, because in this realm we have worshipped stubbornness as if it were virtue, and counted the dead 1 step after they could have been saved. When you go from here, go with lists. Make lists that will embarrass you to read. How many barrels of pitch in the Undercroft at Rook's Rest? How many petty septons trained to read ledgers in Gulltown? How many inspectors have we trained who can count the difference between tithes given and tithes collected without believing it is treason? How many Dragonstone fisheries operate under charter and send their tax to the Court of Winter Oaths rather than to local lords who whisper that old rights are theirs by blood? How many garrison commanders can recite the doctrine for riot quelling without spilling blood? How many girls from the Riverlands apprenticed to shipwrights in Lannisport have returned and started counting houses of their own? How many sons of Unsullied have been enrolled in schools with the same stubbornness as the sons of bakers? How many? If your clerk cannot answer within the time it takes to drink a cup of small beer, whip the clerk or replace the cup with water in future. This is not cruelty. This is sanity. Sanity is the only real mercy left to kings. And when you look out of these windows, remember what you do not see. You do not see smoldering ruins. You do not see flayed banners. You do not see dragons, because dragons are a story we have folded into our annals and will unfold again only if we decide we want to spend that much on awe. You see roofs stripped long ago to save lives, now restored with slate. You see streets where vendors shout about fish rather than about famine. You see a rebuilt September, smaller at the crown and larger at its base, because that is how the faith ought to look. You see a garrison whose weapons are sharp and whose accounts are sharpener. You see small boats coming in with cargo not of foreign gold but of familiar goods. You see a city that believes it can breathe tomorrow. That belief will keep people from asking dangerous questions as long as it is honored not with pomp but with proof. We will be tempted to try a new show of sin and wrath. The realm loves a holiday. If we must, hold the holiday, but make the center of it not executions but races. Let the fastest runners carry letters that tell of what has been rebuilt. Speed is better entertainment than blood for those who have known both. We will be tempted to scrawl new laws on old parchment. If we must, test them in cities before we export them to fields. Fields forgive neither quickly nor slowly. We will be tempted to change coinage. Resist. Coin speaks a language that grows harder to parse with every translation. If you crave a lesson that you can keep in your pocket and touch when fear grips you like the weather, take this. The realm is united not when all its lords agree, nor when all its people sing the same verse, nor even when we have beaten the same enemy in a season. It is united when a cart can move from White Harbor to the Reach and pay the same fee for the same bridge to the same crown. It is united when a letter written in the Vale can be understood by a clerk in Sunspear and by a fishmonger in Lannisport. It is united when a mother in Flea Bottom can predict, not hope, what the penalty will be if her son steals a loaf. That predictability is the justice you owe. The Queen gave it because her affection for fear had learned a new partner, respect for the boring. I have completed the analysis you demanded and the confession you did not. The past was a series of catastrophes wielded as opportunities. The future is a series of opportunities to be mistaken for catastrophes. Keep the clerks fed. Keep the priests polite. Keep the lords busy. Keep the roads open. Keep the courts open longer. Save money where it will not be seen and spend money where it will. Do not be ashamed to buy love. It is cheaper than war. Do not be ashamed to rent fear. It is cheaper than love. Use both in proportions that let you sleep because sleep makes sovereigns reasonable. When your enemies, yes, you still have them, request audience, grant it in the afternoon, when the light makes their faces honest. When your friends remind you of your debts, pay them in the morning, before you have had time to imagine reasons not to. When the bank sends letters, invite them to breakfast and feed them porridge. When the faith requests a sermon, smile and tell them you will attend. When the North sends delegations that smell of wood smoke and suspicion, embrace the smoke and ignore the suspicion. When the sea brings a storm, send ships anyway. This is not romantic. It is how nations live when they are tired of dying. We have done something that is both natural and rare. We have put a rope through the 7 kingdoms and tied a knot that does not strangle. Do not brag. Bragging weakens knots. Test it. Test it with numbers, with stories, with the quiet acceptance of citizens who have learned to sigh instead of scream. Then strengthen it for your successor, who will be less forgiving of your sprints and will need your records more than your heroics. The lives we save will be ordinary. You will not be sung for this. Good. Songs belong to those whose names soften children's sleep. You must settle for your name written on the backs of ledgers and on the bottoms of bridges. It will be enough. It is the measure by which futures decide either to keep you or to learn to live without you. There remains the matter of the Vale, that airy fortress whose lords confuse altitude with immunity. Our union could not ignore them, but it did not need to conquer them. The Vale's love is as rare as ripe figs in winter. Their obedience is purchasable when they are made to feel both on display and indispensable. We did not march the Eyrie. We marched the roads beneath it. The Bloody Gate is a monument to pride, not to trade. Instead of hammering pride, we saturated trade. We quartered a royal caravan at the footholds, a permanent market with royal measure sticks, royal weights, and royal scribes to tally debts payable in spring's first copper. Every iron rod of those scales became a little law. Vale merchants, forced to pass our tents to avoid paying fees elsewhere, discovered our fees were lower and our receipts honored faster. Their lord could refuse our envoys, but he could not refuse the smell of honey cakes baked in stoves that paid our tax. Their knights could decline our invitations, but their stewards queued anyway. That queue was our embassy. In time, the boy lord came down for spectacle, and left having eaten our bread. No oath was demanded because none was required. He had spent a day beneath our banners in comfort and gone home richer than he arrived. People resent what humiliates them. They accept what feeds them. After 3 such visits, we announced a joint patrol of Vale men and Crown men along the high road, staffed entirely by second sons who liked each other's gambling habits more than they liked their father's lectures. The patrol succeeded because we paid the inns along the road a modest stipend to house them in separate rooms despite the temptation to make soldiers sleep 2 to a bed. Sleep is a cheaper bribe than coin when you are tired. The Vale learned to call our men by their names. That is the sound of a hinge swinging. The Riverlands required a different hand. A river holds everything that has been dropped into it. Corpses, oaths, tools, grudges. You cannot purify a river with laws alone. You must dredge. We dredged. Crossing rights were standardized, yes, but we also standardized compensations for flood damage inflicted by armies past and present. Nothing soothes like an honest list of wrongs recognized by a sovereign who does not propose to love you but does propose to pay you. Edmure Tully, steady, slightly confused by life, perfectly suited to the work of enduring it, was restored to his seat under conditions that made him the most reliable person in the realm. His honor was publicly tied to the performance of his bailiffs. If the number of unresolved petitions in his domain exceeded a set figure at year's end, his annuity dropped by 1/10. If it fell below another figure, he received a bonus he could use only on mills and bridges. It is amazing how quickly a lord discovers the beauty of a petition when his purse notices it too. We put the surviving phrase to work on what they had neglected. Ferrying. Not for free and not for forgiveness. At our price, the Crown took 1/3 of their profits and used it to seat a river watch that inspected barges for hidden arms and hidden corpses alike. The first season, smugglers laughed. The second season, smugglers moved their cargo at night. The third season, lantern finds donated to orphanages converted laughter into silence. The fourth season, the river no longer smelled of quick graves. The Crownlands held together with the glue of proximity. The Stormlands held because storms teach men that roofs matter more than feuds. The legitimized scion of Storm's End, whose name had once been a gossip, now became a schedule. He was given 3 duties and measured by 3 columns. First, coastal batteries refitted with modern Scorpions. Each crew drilled against a wind clock, not a sun clock. Second, caravans from the King's Road that could traverse the march in half the time due to waystations staffed by old men too stubborn to die and too proud to steal. Third, training cadres who could turn boys into sailors before the sea did. Every failure to meet schedule shaved an ounce off his honor with the Queen. Every success added 3. He learned to wear honor like armor. He learned to sleep facing east so he would see storms earlier. He learned that the Crown's gratitude arrives in the form of work. The Reach, offended by the loss of its pomp and the smell of ash on its roses, had to be turned into a granary with a soul rather than a soul with a granary. Randall Tarley's preferences were accommodated and outflanked. He was permitted to drill and to scowl, but the Reach was assigned tasks that could not be accomplished with horses. Canals cut to cheat the lazy bends of rivers, sluices that could be raised in drought and lowered when flood threatened, a cadre of women called the Green Hands trained by maesters in seed selection who carried packets of barley like relics. The Reach loves hierarchy. The Green Hands gave them a new one that produced bread. We set their ceremonial calendar to coincide with agricultural tasks. The Feast of First Furrow was declared a royal holiday everywhere, but in the Reach it came with exemptions for laborers who could skip it to plant. They received a double ration later if they did. People love being paid to be practical. You make a tradition friendly by allowing it to be avoided without guilt. Dorne prides itself on being the exception to the rule, and so we wrote exceptions as rules. Their marriage customs were never a problem to the Crown except when made into a pretext for defiance. We removed the pretext by acknowledging their inheritance law in edicts written as meticulously as a Sivas rulebook. In exchange, Sunspear accepted that every caravan bound for Old Town or King's Landing from the Boneway would be inspected by joint teams. 1 Crown appointee, 1 Dornish, 1 faithful accountant whose only job was to keep time. Keeping TI. Me was the true power. Caravans that arrived late and could blame the inspectors received compensation. Caravans that arrived late for their own reasons paid a small, humiliating tax called the hour. Dornish pride prefers flamboyant insult. We answered with petty arithmetic. Their princes flowed with it like dancers forced into a slow song. The Iron Islands are snowstorms with boats. They had to be locked into a cycle of rewards that did not smell of heroism. Heroism sends men to sea with god-mad eyes. Profit sends them to sea with lists. We legalized salvage on a scale that made reeving seem like wasted effort. Any wreck within 20 miles of a marked crown buoy could be claimed by crews who registered their intent with the harbormaster before departure and paid a portion of whatever they recovered into a fund used to repair storm damage in villages. It sounds banal. It is a leash hidden in a bowl of stew. The harbormaster's ledger became a family Bible. Names entered meant a right to dock space, to rope, to salt, to a hearing before a judge if a mainlander tried to cheat them. A man who sees his name hand-copied in royal ink begins to develop a taste for being known. Euron's bravado died on a channel choked with fire, and his replacements learned to boast in taverns about weights and depths. This is the kind of insult the drowned god never forgives and always tolerates. When the wall, wounded and sulking, demanded attention, we did not pretend, never again, that it was a place we could ignore without paying later. We respected its purpose without worshipping its myth. The Night's Watch was not dissolved, which would have gratified poets and defrauded reality. It was professionalized. The Watch received licenses to manage forest tracts south of the wall with proceeds reserved for its own salaries. Peddlers who set up shop at Eastwatch and Shadow Tower paid fees set low enough that they flourished and high enough that the Watch learned to count as carefully as it watched. The free folk were made into participants, not subjects. Families that crossed under flags of truce were given a choice: resettle under charters that tied them to thin strips of land far from quarrels, or hire on as winter guides under terms that gave them an out if they smelled folly. Guides were paid in iron tools and salt and, more seductively, in letters of passage they could use to visit markets without being shaken down. Markets are the crown's sermons. They convert more pagans than priests do. A word about the citadel and the maesters who believe knowledge should be put down where no one can touch it. Their habit of bending to power without calling it bending makes them both useful and vexing. We neither flattered nor threatened. We paid. We offered endowments for chairs of engineering, agronomy, and navigation. Each endowed chair obligated to send 2 apprentices a year to King's Landing to serve as surveyors. The citadel could pretend it was training scholars. We used them as clerks and as spies with good penmanship. In return, we conceded a long-argued point of pride that maesters enjoy whispering about in their cups: their right to certify scales and measures in ports that fly the crown's pennant. That certification yielded a fee so small the citadel tried to refuse it on philosophical grounds for a season before discovering that small fees over many ports pile up into big numbers. The maester's pride was soothed by stamps. Our need was met by the boring miracle of consistency. There is a style of rule that mistakes pageantry for power. We broke that taste with a series of unadorned habits. Royal edicts were written twice, once in High Valyrian and once in the mud of common tongue. The former flattered the old order. The latter told butchers when their stalls would be inspected. We put the common in the same ink as the elegant, and we held 3 subscriptions open at all times to scribes who could copy those edicts on demand for villages too remote to send a rider. The copies cost a pittance because the crown underwrote the ink. Men who spend their days in libraries think the price of ink is a triviality. They have not watched a mother decide whether to write a letter or buy a loaf. Lowering the cost of ink was a minor miracle disguised as thrift. There is another style of rule that mistakes cruelty for strength. We were not gentle, but we were exact. Punishments that once sprouted from peak like mushrooms sprout from rot were pruned back to a garden. The schedule of fines posted outside the courts, schedules not homilies, told any man what a beating cost, what a theft cost, what a slander cost, what a riot cost, what a failure to answer a summons cost. Penalties for the rich were multiplied by 10. Penalties for the poor were payable partially in labor. This will outrage anyone who believes justice is the art of ignoring distinctions. But distinctions exist whether you fancy them or not. We codified them to reduce opportunism. The wealthy hate nothing so much as a predictable bargain that denies them the leisure of special pleading. The poor hate nothing so much as a whim made law. Both kinds of hate simmer. Our law cooled both to a manageable simmer. The pot is less likely to boil over if you stir at the same time every day. You will ask about spies, though you will not say the word. The realm runs on information like a ship runs on wind. We did not rely on the whispers of men whose faces we bought in alleys. The Queen had had enough of that theater to last lifetimes. We built our intelligence from upstream, not downstream. Surveyors counted. Inspectors wrote. Harbor masters stamped. And every stamp, every count, every receipt was a signal bundled with legitimacy. When patterns broke, we investigated the break rather than the rumor. Rumors multiply. Broken patterns isolate causes. A mill ceases to mint coin for 2 months when every mill along the river minted coin as usual. We ask why. A patrol along a quiet stretch of the King's Road begins to report double the number of vagrants despite the same weather and the same harvest. We ask why. A guild's apprentices begin to arrive late 3 days in a row at a school whose clock has not failed. We ask why. Whoever asks why before they ask who will catch most of the who later when it matters. We had a few shadows who did the wet work that history decries in public and pays for in private. We kept them hungry and unpraised. Feed heroes and they become martyrs. Feed clerks and they become institutions. The fiscal engine of the realm deserves one more candor. It was never the mint. It was the scale. We weighed more than we priced. Coin can be clipped. Scales can be cheated too, but they must be cheated in the open, and the public can be taught to notice. We toured markets with a display scale, a great brass thing carried by 8 men in plain livery that we would set in the square. Anyone who brought their weights to match ours received a little seal they could nail to their stall. Anyone who did not was fined in public and asked to bring their mother to watch. If they had no mother, they were asked to bring their favorite nephew. Public embarrassment teaches more slowly than flogging but endures longer in the mind. After 2 years, open cheating declined. Hidden cheating, always craftier, was driven into smaller corners where it could be tolerated as the price of doing business rather than as a threat to the whole. The coinage itself we left largely intact, as promised, with one quiet innovation that mattered more in practice than in poetry. We introduced tally sticks again, not as a relic but as a credit instrument for grain. Farmers who delivered beyond their quota received sticks issued by the crown granaries, notched to indicate amounts of barley or oats redeemable against certain taxes. The sticks could be traded like coin at a discount set by the market. They circulated in the countryside like a whisper. The nobility mocked them until they discovered that tally sticks were less likely to be stolen than purses and more likely to be accepted by hungry men. Grain credits are the only kindness markets understand during famine. We learned that kindnesses embedded in would outlast kindnesses embedded in sermons. You will suppose that marrying allies would have wrapped all this in lace. You will be only half right. Marriages were used with exquisite meanness. They were contracts dressed as dances. We did not abandon the Southron practice of writing more pages for a wedding than anyone would write for a treaty. We intensified it. Every marriage that mattered came with clauses tied to measurable promises. A dowry dispersed not all at once but in tranches keyed to milestones. 3 bridges completed, a temple roof replaced, a levy answered in full instead of to anniversaries. The faith blanched at prayers that sounded like ledgers until we showed them ledgers that read like answered prayers. A girl given to a lordling beyond her family's ambition was given an annuity in her own name paid in salt and firewood, not in coin that her husband could spend. Within 2 seasons, husbands learned to treat wives' annuities as part of the household stability rather than as a rival treasury. The quiet power lodged in hearthwood is underestimated by poets who never chopped a stick in their cosset lives. In war, glory comes like weather. In governance, glory arrives with the tax roll. We published the tax rolls once a year and let any man read them. The numbers meant little to most. They meant everything to the few who could turn them into comparisons. That handful became the realm's critics and its immune system. They sent letters to the editors of broadsheets we tolerated and sometimes underwrote with quiet copper. We did not silence them when they scored a point. We answered with corrections when they scored with error, and with admissions when they scored with truth. If you make a habit of being right, you can afford to be wrong publicly thrice a year. People forgive mistakes that do not hide. They crucify secrets. All this, however, would have dissolved if the army had not been taught to end. Armies do not like ending. Men who learn to be significant with a spear are reluctant to be ordinary with a rake. We softened the landing by creating a pension that paid out not in coin but in priority. A soldier who served under crown banners for more than 2 winters was placed on a list. That list meant he would be first in line when the crown called for laborers on roads, bridges, mills, walls. His children would be first for places in schools that taught numbers and letters without turning those letters into treason. His wife would be first in queues for bread in lean months. First in line is a cheaper promise than coin and more prized. Lines are the visible theology of survival. The old veterans who once haunted taverns now haunted planning meetings, because planning meetings wrote the lists. Let us descend into minutes instead of months. A campaign without minuteness is a poem. We cannot afford poetry except on feast days. The Northern Campaign's Day of Days unfolded in 4 pulses, each the length of a candle. Before dawn, our skirmishers tied bells to stakes and placed them where the snow would conceal them. The dead disturbed the bells. Our archers loosed on sound instead of silhouette. In the first light, our cavalry dismounted to draw the dead into trained formations that they thought were improvised. The only kindness we could afford herders of horses who still thought speed a god. At mid-morning, our sappers lit the dark veins of wildfire we had buried in trenches that drank narrow streams. The liquid fire floated and ran and turned the plain into a smoking chessboard whose squares we could name in shorthands that our runners had memorized. At noon, our reserves pressed where the dead thinned, not because we saw gaps, but because our oil flares sig. Nailed where arrows flickered shortest, and an arrow that fails to arrive tells you more than a lookout who shouts that he sees. In the late afternoon, when men's minds slow and the cold has reached bone, we played our last piece. A regiment trained to march backward while facing forward, giving the impression of retreat without the disorder. The Night King did not think in impressions. His captains did. They overreached, and that overreach widened into a wound. These are the details people forget when they want to attribute survival to one throw of a knife and the courage to throw it. It was not a throw. It was a series of arrangements that made the throw possible. You will say we were lucky that the dead had a single center. You will be right. The living did not. That is why arrangements matter more when you have no center. The arrangements continued south, where a dragon died not because iron is braver than fire, but because emptiness was hungrier than flame. We prepared emptiness like a meal. The cogs along the harbor that became clouds were packed by men who lost family in the September and did not care whether their tears tasted of salt or of smoke. The nets that gummed wings were woven by grandmothers who had been paid in advance and in public. The fire ships that belched their last were rowed by criminals given a choice between a short life with pay and a long sentence without it. People will do anything if you describe it as choosing. The dragon's fall was not a miracle. It was an answer to a question we had been asking since the day the queen climbed the steps of the throne in a dress that whispered like knives. What do we owe to breath, to bread, to tomorrow? The blending of the foreign arms into permanence required grosser sensibilities. The Unsullied, who had learned to wait for orders as if orders were a kind of food, needed clocks and squares. We gave them both. Their garrisons along the Rose Road were built around plazas sized to fit their squares, with market days scheduled to avoid the hour of drill. Their commanders were invited to sit as a third voice on petty courts whenever the litigants were both strangers to the region. This had 2 effects. It taught the Unsullied ambiguities, and it taught the locals that the foreigner could be fair. Fairness is sometimes an insult to memory, but memories grow duller when mothers notice that disputes end before supper rather than after funerals. Weddings between Unsullied and locals were rare and quietly encouraged when they happened, not for spectacle but for the way children learned to translate between customs without writing a law. The Dothraki, who are the wind pretending to be men, were taught to value timetables. We equipped the Coast Watch with small signal towers at intervals a good horse could cover in a half hour. The tower's keepers were old Dothraki who had survived their youth and found their knees less forgiving than their pride. To each we gave a whistle and a flag and a stipend for feeding any rider who carried sealed orders. Orders deliver the taste of authority to men who think a saddle is the only throne. They began to boast not of kills but of speed between towers. We added a festival of distance once a year, with the Queen awarding a chain to the fastest rider who had delivered 5 sealed packets in correct sequence along the coast. The chain was cheap tin. The pride was pure. You can coax a people toward habit by disguising habit as contest. We did not neglect the sea. The royal fleet rebuilt, re-greased, re-rigged, trained in the narrow art of running away correctly. It is more difficult than charging. Captains were punished not for losing engagements but for losing order. We instituted drills where the admiral signaled a feigned panic and crews were graded on their ability to withdraw on pre-agreed lines without colliding. The first season was humiliating. By the third, we could use retreat as a weapon. Pirates who thought they had cornered us found themselves stretched along an empty sea, their sails flapping while ours caught a second wind off shoals they did not know. We bought charts from men who had never seen a court because they had never seen a reason to leave a coastline. We gave them pensions and told them we would name bays after their wives. Names feed vanity more cleanly than coin does. The faith stomach is never satisfied, and that is fine because we learned to make it digestible. We formalized the poor sisters' work beyond the city so that their hospice beds became fever buffer zones. In exchange for stipends, they agreed to preserve the bodies of those who died on the road until surveyors could count them. Counting the dead is a macabre art. It is also the only way to keep epidemics from hiding. The faith resisted the implication that death needed a clerk until we reminded them that mourning without numbers leads to the kind of panic that closes temples. They yielded. Silence is not consent. It is acceptance of necessity. That was enough. Because no realm stands without stories, we hired storytellers. Not minstrels, not actors, but sober men and women with good memories and better diction who traveled with small cases full of carved figurines. In village squares, they told the tale of the winter campaign not as a saga of a single hero, but as a sequence of decisions taken by people like those gathered to listen. They pointed to the miller in the crowd and explained how his flour became biscuit that kept a scout alive on a certain night. They pointed to the old widow and explained how her complaint about a broken culvert had saved an entire battalion by allowing a ditch to flood. You think this trivial? It is the spine of the realm. When ordinary people picture themselves in the total work, they do not become heroes. They become citizens. Citizens pay taxes even when they grumble. Subjects revolt even when they sing. We cannot keep a rope through 7 kingdoms without grease. Grease is petty sea. Eruption cleansed into sanctioned commission. We found the small places where bribes clustered like flies on fruit, dock permits, harvest tallies, licensing for taverns, and we made the bribe official. Call it a fee. Publish it. Earmark half for the official whose palm would have been greased and half for a fund that paid for wells.
Corruption at tes sunlight.
It shrinks or moves. We chased it each time it moved, not with fury but with forms. Rage against bribes wins headlines and loses wars. Converting bribes into fees wins streets and loses nothing but the pleasure of being judgmental. You wish to hear of the hand and how his iron softened. The hand's power is said to be the power to command. The real power is to endure. We set a custom that any decree that required more than 2 pages to explain could not be enacted by the hand alone. It had to be discussed by the small council in the open for 1 hour for 3 days, and a clerk was required to summarize the arguments and post that summary in markets. The effect was not transparency theatrically worshipped. It was laziness punished. Bad decrees withered under the burden of being defended by men who would rather hunt. Good decrees survived the boredom. The hand earned a reputation for patience rather than for wrath. Wrath entertains. Patience governs. We prepared the realm to be bored. Boredom is the sweet fruit of stability. It rots unless preserved. We preserved it by rotating festivals so no one town could claim the crown's presence thrice in a row. We preserved it by making inspections predictable. We preserved it by making the most contentious question at guild meetings nominal: where to place the chairs. People who argue about chairs are not arming themselves. People who read the minutes of last year's meeting to see if the price of chalk was fairly set last spring are not writing letters to captains across the sea. Boredom, when curated, is the best defense against disorder. It is also a kindness to children, who deserve to grow up thinking the extraordinary is rare because it is. I will not pretend every choice turned out as intended. The Great Grain Compact of Year 4 nearly sank us because we believed we could predict the winds that would carry ships from Pentos. We could not. The North's rains failed and the ships were becalmed, and for 3 weeks all the ledgers in the world could not feed a child. The Queen broke her rule then. She opened the royal stores without paperwork and let the city feed for free until the first convoy touched the quays. There were those who warned that such generosity would teach dependence. Those people have never watched a baker cry into his flour. Sometimes you must buy the gratitude of a generation. It pays interest slower than coin, but it pays. The next winter, when we needed to enforce a stricter ration due to pests in the Reach, the city remembered the open doors. It obeyed more easily than any lecture could have wrung from it. Another error. We believed that granting the unsullied land along the Trident would insulate them from prejudice and embed them in a quilt of villages. Instead, a band of petty lords began to skim their grain credits and to slur them with the lazy cruelty of men whose courage is large only when their target is lawful. The unsullied do not break unless ordered. They also do not complain unless taught to. The trouble simmered until one of our surveyors, a woman with a lame leg and a sharper tongue than was entirely safe, wrote a report that was more accusation than accounting. We read it and reacted in the old way, with edicts and threats. The skimming stopped and then leaked back like a tide. We corrected the correction. We sent a market, not a magistrate. A monthly fair rotated among the unsullied villages with crown guards interdicted from serving as guards. Prices posted, entertainment provided, stalls guarded by watchmen drawn from a pool that included 2 men from each suspicious lord's household. Those watchmen learned to collect and to pay and to be seen doing both. Within 3 fairs, the skimming ceased, not because we terrorized it, but because we embedded it in a schedule that rewarded other appetites. Petty lords prefer predictable luxury to risky theft. Give them more of the former and fewer of the latter, and they will become our janitors. We have spoken of end states. There are variables within them that deserve their own paragraphs. In the hard monarchy pathway, a key determinant is the Queen's attention to succession narratives that do not insult the North. An heir who is seen to spend a winter in Winterfell, who makes a show of being cold and bearing it without fashion, who learns to name the differences between snows by taste. His crown sits easier on the northern neck. Conversely, an heir who is rumored to sneer at wool will draw sneers that turn into spears. In the federated peace, the hazard is doctrinal. When you give regions the right to argue, they will practice the art until it becomes an industry. The solution is to build in exhaustion. Courts must adjourn for seasons. Councils must cease for sowing and harvest. Bylaws must require days in the field for the loudest opponents. Make talkers carry sacks of barley for a week in autumn and watch their mouths find new respect for brevity. In the theocratic upset, a critical fault line will be the faith's definition of purity. If purity is defined as abstention from vice, the Crown can pay stipends to veterans by calling them holy labor. If purity is defined as abstention from the Crown, that is war. We must fund the first definition into fashion by producing pamphlets that yoke cleanliness of streets to cleanliness of hearts. Pamphlets are prayers that paid for their own ink. The foreign entanglement scenario pivots on a single fulcrum: shipwrights. If they begin to prefer foreign contracts because foreign admirals pay late but whisper sweetly, draw them back by commissioning repairs and paying EA. RLY with a small, insulting lecture attached. Insults given with coin are forgiven faster than insults given with law. If the shock of succession looms, broker marriages among the second rung of houses rather than among the first. A second-rung marriage makes fewer enemies and creates more friends who are hungry to be first-rung next generation. The first rung is crowded with men who think friendship can be inherited. Cannot. It must be paid. There is an unlovely matter that will arrive regardless of our choreography. Famine somewhere. Not everywhere, not every year, but somewhere each cycle. Famine creates gods and ghosts. We must be ready to offer a god that eats ghosts. It will have a bureaucrat's face and a mother's hands. We will call it the Grain Office, and we will staff it with widows because widows see truth quicker than anyone else and waste less time saying it gently. The Grain Office will keep a ledger of barns. It will know which barns are full and which are lying. It will have authority to open any barn with 3 witnesses, one of whom must be a child whose father died under crown colors or under no colors at all, because children are the severest judges of hoarding. It will post notices in simple script that even a tired man can read after dusk. When it errs, and it must err on the side of life. Charge the excess to the crown and pay it with years of calm later. Calm yields coin. Coin buys time. Time buys thinking. Thinking buys more calm. This is the cycle we prefer to gamble on. We have delayed so far the superstitions that men dress up as prophecies. They crush nerves in palaces as surely as frost crushes buds in fields. There are those who keep counting children and miscounting years. There are those who find meaning in shards of glass and see kingdoms in puddles of wine. They will whisper ruin because ruin cleans the palate of their lives. Our answer cannot be to argue with them, because argument dignifies appetite. Our answer must be to fill their days. Idle men with frightening imaginations must be given tasks that are shapes. Laying tiles, paving roads, stitching sails. We will fund guilds that accept them without asking lineage and that grade them ruthlessly on forms that you cannot fake with omens. There is a reason the ancients built baths and bridges. They soak madness out of bodies and carry anger away from towns. If we must indulge prophecy, we will indulge it by commissioning tapestries that interpret victory as a product of discipline rather than of destiny. Children grow up looking at walls. Make the walls flattering. You will think I have forgotten the Queen's enemies who survived. I have not. Some we bought, some we buried, some we banked. Banking an enemy is the art of turning them into a threat for someone else. We gave certain exiles letters of marque to harry pirates in the stepstones under conditions that tied their profit to our unhappiness. If they attacked a ship flying our pennant, their bond was forfeit and their families would be placed in our care, where care was defined as a stipend and a measured absence of news. Those families lived better than they had. Those captains minded their prey. Do not overuse such bonds. They create a class of men practiced at being useful and disloyal. Use them to plug holes in storms. Then forget them until the next storm. Forgetting is a tool often more potent than remembering. We come now to the question of how long such a union can keep its worth before becoming counterfeit. A span of years becomes a habit when those born into it reach the age when they call the old men sir without thinking the word is an insult. That takes 15 years. Within those years, we must accept the appearance of complacency as the cost of substance. Complacency breeds fatness, which breeds contempt, which breeds theater. To bleed the theater of its danger, we will build a cheap one and underwrite the plays. Let the fiery young write their satires and their thinly veiled threats, and let them perform in halls where the exits are numerous and the lanterns trimmed. When the stage is subsidized, the street is less alluring. Actors drain revolts of their actors. We will name the theater the Winter's Thaw and encourage jokes about the Queen's dress in summer. A monarch who cannot endure mockery in measured doses deserves worse. Those 15 years will change the shape of crime. Today, brigands gather on roads that are bad and in towns that are poorer. Tomorrow, they will gather in counting houses when they realize figures can be robbed more safely than caravans. Embezzlement is the banditry of warm rooms. We will recruit bandits into the counting house and count the room. Thieves who make good clerks are common. Clerks who make good thieves are rare and therefore precious. We will catch them by giving them chances to be honest that are too tempting to refuse. Place a small bag of coin where it can be stolen with no consequence. Mark it. See who steals it. Promote that one a step at a time, watching for when he stops stealing, because when he stops is when he has understood what he can become. Redeemed men are braver than virtuous ones. Their loyalty tastes like an oath they wrote themselves. If we have been meticulous with receipts, generous where the city could see, exact where the law required, and dull where spectacle does harm, we will face the time when children ask the question that terrifies sovereigns. Why do we have a queen? The honest answer is because bridges fall when you leave them to committees. The answer we will give is gentler, because the queen has learned to read ledgers so you never have to, because someone must remind lords that a promise written is a debt, because flags are useful when fog comes and fog always comes. We will demonstrate the necessity of a crown by doing nothing dramatic and everything on time. Try it. The world will think you are harmless. That is the hour victory wears a shawl and s. Lips past men who shout. You would like me to confess fear. I will confess it. I fear a spring so fat the realm forgets why it rationed its winter. I fear gold multiplied faster than gratitude, and gratitude forgotten the instant silk returns to the markets. I fear young men who have never buried a friend to frost singing songs about how war makes kings taller. The antidote to these poisons is not mumbled warnings. It is a cost that stays visible. We will keep one road under repair at all times within sight of the capital's gates. People will pass work and remember what work is. We will keep one granary sealed and unsealed every year with ceremony. Not to show off food, but to show off discipline. We will keep one regiment drilling with brooms instead of spears in the square once a month. The soldiers smiling at children and the children laughing at the brooms. Laughter is insurance. Laughter cannot kill you if you are the one who provoked it on purpose. Perhaps you expect that the Queen's personal conscience weighed against these calculations like a millstone. It did not. Conscience is heavy when it is private. It is buoyant when born with a city. She learned, hard lesson, paid for in sleeplessness, that cruelty justified by fear corrodes. Cruelty justified by arithmetic is easier to revise because it can be measured. She permitted herself 3 mercies a year. No one knew which 3 until they had been made. A boy spared because his mother had returned his stolen coin before dawn. A guild absolved of a fine because its apprentices, unasked, had dug a trench that saved a street from flood. A lord pardoned from humiliation because he had endured it once already in his youth, and we did not wish to teach his children that shame returns forever. Those mercies purchased more acceptance than any theory of benevolence could. Mercy is a spice. Overused, it ruins soup. Used rarely, mouths remember. The last branch of the tree reaches into a future that enjoys inventing storms for us to weather. The day will come when some resource we believe endless becomes a weapon wielded by someone impatient. It may be glass, worked thin and cheap in a port whose name none of us now can spell. It may be salt, scarce for reasons we will learn too late. It may be books, copied by men across the sea faster than our scribes can move their hands. The weapon will be price. Goods will arrive cheaper than ours and dressed as blessings. We will be urged to match their price without matching their method. We will be tempted to lower wages and call it prudence. Resist. A realm cannot underbid the world and remain a realm. We must either become the place that buys best or the place that sells what cannot be copied. The latter requires a luxury we have not allowed ourselves. Artistic pride. We will fund a school of artisans whose only work is to perfect uncheatable crafts. Inlay that takes months, steel with temper known by the sound it makes when touched, glass with bubbles placed as constellations that map our skies. Let the world undercut our rope and barrel and bread. We will sell its saints and swords. The saints will be carved without faces so every buyer can imagine his own. The swords will be named after bridges. You will think this airy. It is not. Prestige is policy. When foreign purses long to own a little of us, they pay in ways tariffs cannot trap. They pay with visits that teach their children to call our streets clean and our courts fair. Fairness can be sold when it is scarce. The more we sell, the more we must deliver. That is the restraint art imposes on power. The Queen would bridle at the word art. She smiled, however, when we brought her accounts of how many days visitors stayed. People stay longer where they feel safe. Safety, advertised, compounds like interest. A city famous for drains is a capital where lords bring daughters without armed escorts. That is wealth turned into peace without anyone calling it a miracle. There is a grief that cannot be written out of a ledger. Many you loved died at the exact moment when you decided your love was finally safe. Governing does not forgive grief. It usurps it. We made a place for grief that did not split the realm into festivals of pain. The mourner's court sat twice a year in the square. Anyone could step onto a low platform and speak the name of their dead and one fact about them that was useful. A way to sew a shirt faster, a way to snare a hair without wasting wire, a way to turn last year's lamp oil into this year's polish. The court wrote the facts in a book bound with leather the color of dusk. The book became a manual. Mothers teaching daughters learned to quote the dead by page number. One day a girl in Flea Bottom tried to outdo a boy in the Vale by competing with the number of useful dead she could recite. The boy lost and laughed. That laugh carried to the red keep through 3 mouths and made the queen put down her cup slower than usual. A state that can make children compete in usefulness rather than in wound will probably live. Now I will return to immediate instructions, because briefings drift toward sermons if they forget the next hour. Call the harbor and ask which foreign ships declared ballast as cargo in the last 12 days. Cross that list with the lists of guilds that purchased rope beyond the usual allotment this season. An old trick has returned. Men joke about ballast when they mean blades. Send 2 surveyors with scales and a priest with a pair of hearing ears to the pier when the next such ship unloads. The hearing ears will collect the dockside mutter. If there is to be trouble, it will apply for a permit. We will deny the permit and open a stall selling very cheap knives. Cheap enough that those who came to shout about high prices will be disoriented by fairness. Ask the grain office for the tally of threshing failures reported in the last fortnight in the band of villages between Maidenpool and Herenhall. If the number is above 40, send the green hands. If it is above 80, send them with seed paid half by us and half by the Faith's charity box, and record which half the village mentions first. A village that mentions the crown first is learning gratitude in a way that can be converted into loyalty later. A village that mentions the faith first is learning comfort in a way that must be respected but watched. Watch comfort. Comfort breeds credulity in the wrong saviors. Commission the next class of surveyors from the Citadel with this condition attached. Each must, during training, spend 1 week apprentice to a midwife and 1 to a miller. Births and flour are the only numbers that catch everything else. A surveyor who knows what a breech birth costs a village in muscle and who has seen what a wet summer does to mills will write different reports. Those reports will make us spend money unequally. Equality is a fraud in the hands of the lazy. Equity is a whip in the hands of the cruel. We practice proportion. The reach receives less pity in years of fat even when it pleads. The Riverlands receives more attention in years of lean even when it boasts. We will be accused of favoritism by men who mistake their luck for merit. Ignore them. Teach your clerks to ignore them. Marry them to patience. Send a letter to the Lord in the Vale whose steward misreported tolls twice. Do not accuse. Ask for a favor. The loan of his falconer for a month to teach the crown's birds to stoop at the right angle in mountain winds. He will be flattered. He will send his man. He will be disturbed when he realizes we know the names of his keepers. Disturbance is a better leash than fear. Fear snaps. Disturbance slackens and tightens with each breath. Write to the widow in Gulltown who keeps the best oysters in a stall so clean sailors call it insulting. Offer to name her stall as supplier to the grain office's inspectors. She will take it. She will keep her knives sharper than most men's swords. Cleanliness spreads like fashion when it is mentioned in the right rooms. Remind the queen to walk the city without pageantry on the first morning after frost. She should buy a toy from a carpenter and a ribbon from a weaver and a sweet from a child. She should pay with coin, not with smiles, and she should let herself be cheated once. That story will travel faster than any decree about mercy. Reinforce the Night's Watch's grant by sending 3 barrels of pitch and a small, excellent mirror to Eastwatch with a note praising their signal practice. Mirrors are better than money for men who stand under low sun and gaze across white nothing. Praise is cheaper than pitch but has less grip on spirits. Send both. Do not neglect the silent business of death by work. Miners die with lungs the color of midnight. Sailors die with bones that ache like confession. Scribes die with eyes that blur the last 2 lines. For each, devise a habit that makes the end feel seen. A miner's family receives a piece of polished black stone small enough to fit in a pocket with the queen's initial cut into it. A sailor's daughter receives a whistle and a permit allowing her to hawk oysters in the street without being moved. A scribe's son receives a pair of spectacles if his eyes merit them, without charge. Spectacles cost nearly nothing when fashioned by the hundreds. The story that they cost the crown much must be allowed to spread. The crown's generosity grows taller when its shoulders are graceful. You will tire of lists. That is the test. When a man tires of lists and continues anyway, he is fit to govern. When he tires and reaches for the wine instead, he is fit to be loved but not to be trusted. We must be trusted more than we are loved. Love is a disorderly currency. Trust pays regular interest. If you must choose between a crowd cheering your name and a clerk who can recite the schedule for sluice maintenance, choose the clerk and nod to the crowd later when you pass a clean canal and do not slip. At last, the rope we tied must be tested by what we cannot prepare. The child who will touch it, pull it, and laugh when it does not break. That child will be born into a realm so ordinary she will think it has always been so. She will grow to believe cornbread falls from shelves on time, that judges arrive before disputes, that ships leave harbor even when the admiral frowns, that priests bless tools before births, that queens open their stores in emergencies like mothers opening their hands. She will not know that we fought for this dullness tooth by tooth. She will not read this briefing. She will instead look out a window and say, with the cruelty of innocence, that the world is boring. Bless her. Born in a boring world, she might grow up to do something unthinkably generous. She might bake extra bread because she expects neighbors. She might build extra benches in a court because she expects crowds. She might not need a queen, or she might, at the first sign of a new winter, go to the market and see a poster with the grain office's schedule and feel in her chest a warmth that is not faith and not fear but recognition. That is all we can buy. It is not small. I have told you how we stitch the cloth and where the seams will most likely split and how to patch them. If you expect certainty, join the faith. If you accept risk, keep the ledgers. If you want songs, build the theater. If you want quiet, build the drains. If you want to unite not for a day or for an enemy but for a habit, keep asking why until even your friends sigh. Then keep asking. The sigh is proof the question is worth the breath. When you leave this room, leave with the knowledge that the crown's power is smaller than the city's patience and larger than any one man's courage. It is the shaded area between ambition and fear. Ambition built a fleet that can retreat without shame. Fear hung bells on stakes in the snow. Between the two, we survived. Between the two, we can prosper. If you must take from the Queen one lesson more, let it be this. She learned, at last, the difference between being obeyed and being relied upon. Obedience won her battles. Reliance won her quiet. Fight for the quiet. It is never glamorous at first. Then one day a child will laugh and call it normal. That laugh is the crown you can wear without cutting your scalp. Wear it well.